Bublitz. I'm the coordinator of the Reading and Writing Studio at Macomb Community College, and I'm going to talk specifically about implementing PowerNotes in one-on-one conferences, which I'm sure instructors are doing a lot of these days as we sort of help students to get online. So in this little portion of the presentation, I'm going to be talking about the role of a writing center, particularly in the research writing process. I'll talk a little bit about my own experiences with PowerNotes because I use it in my own professional work. And I'll be talking about how I've used PowerNotes with both confident and developing writers with some success. So to begin with, when we think about the role of the Writing Center in the research process, our goal, while we obviously help students to conform to their instructors' expectations, we also work really hard on fostering student ownership of their process, particularly in developing a sense of confidence and competence in that learning process. When we're thinking about tech in the Writing Center, we focus on tools that promote, again, independence and confidence. And that's really important to us, that we're not introducing students to technology that's going to make them feel like this is one more thing that's hard for me to do. And so when we're working, when we're selecting technology, we're really careful about that. When I use PowerNotes, I have used it in my own research for pursuing evidence-based practice for the Writing Center. Oh, my camera's still not on. Well, I apologize for that. Oh, here we go. I'm sorry for that. I closed my window there. So I've used it when I'm pursuing evidence-based practice for the Writing Center, and I'm going to show you a little screenshot of a project that I've been working on. This summer, I started to research the process of developing asynchronous feedback for students, and then in March, we very quickly ramped it up. And so this is how I've used PowerNotes in that project particularly. And I'm going to change my share here for just one moment. So this is one of the articles that I was working with, and I just want to show you how this has helped me in my own organization. When we use PowerNotes, if we highlight something, it will pull up the project. And these are the things that I was thinking about when we started moving into asynchronous consultation with students. Accessibility, some of the challenges, problem-centered instruction, standardizing responses, assessment and training, and scheduling concerns. These were not necessarily things that I had in the front of my mind when I began the research process, but this is how I was able to organize my thoughts as I went. This is how the research process goes, as those of us who are students know. But this is also something that we need to teach to students, and this is how I have had a lot of success working with students in the reading and writing studios with PowerNotes. And we're going to go back to screen one again. Excuse me. All right. So when I have been working with introducing PowerNotes to students, these are the points of the research process that we've focused on. First of all, I've introduced this to students before they begin their research. And I found that PowerNotes encourages and empowers them to begin researching. Brett talked about this a little bit before. Sometimes students look at a research paper as, I need to write the paper, then I need to add the information. And that can be really intimidating if you're not sure what to write about. And so this has been helpful to students in seeing how they can develop their thought process as they go. I've found it really helpful with outlining and structure. I've highly encouraged students to use that outlining tool because, again, as you go and you learn things, you can use these notes that pop up in your mind to create an outline for that eventual document. And we've also talked about it when we're working on revision in terms of selecting and strengthening arguments. Sometimes it's a hard sell for students to say, well, you may not use every quote that's interesting to you as you write. And this is a great way for students to not feel like they're losing something. So, and I want to focus specifically on working with both confident and developing writers. Sometimes in the Writing Center, it can be a challenge to introduce new technology to writers who are still kind of getting the hang of writing in the first place, particularly students who are getting used to technology. but I really think this has been useful for us in students, even if they are not 100% comfortable with working online. And so when we're thinking about starting places, I found that PowerNotes has been helpful for confident writers because, once again, it reinforces that effective research writing process. That we begin with research, we collect our ideas, we make our notes, and from there, we decide what we write. For developing writers, I found this has been really helpful because it's a less intimidating way to begin to engage with the research. When students begin their research and say, I don't know what points I'm looking for, that can feel really difficult to begin to read articles. I found that PowerNotes helps students to just make notes of what's interesting as you read. It creates kind of a trail of breadcrumbs for them so that they can see that their reading hasn't been in vain. You can engage with this reading. Not everything that you read is going to be useful to you, but you can save it all and decide that later. I've also found PowerNotes to be really helpful in terms of helping students create knowledge. For confident writers, those tags that we use when we create notes in PowerNotes help them to name those connections across sources. This might even help them find connections they didn't realize they were seeing before. If I already have a category in my notes that says problem-based instruction, or a category in my notes that says, benefits of fracking, or whatever it is we're writing about, it can be helpful to begin to categorize those things. For developing writers, as I mentioned a little bit before, I found PowerNotes confers value on their own thoughts and connections as they read. For developing writers, again, confidence can be a really big issue. And when you're asked to research, it feels like, man, I'm not supposed to include my own ideas here. I just need to use evidence from experts. And I've found that creating this trail in the way that PowerNotes allows you to do lets them see that what they thought about the reading as they read is important and can and should be used in that final document. We've also talked about this during this presentation as well, but I've found PowerNotes really helpful for students in keeping track of that knowledge. For confident writers, it really, again, helps them to classify, organize, and use the notes that they take. Sometimes annotation is in itself a daunting task, and I think this is a really great way for students to see that the notes that you take, the thoughts that you have, we can use them all together, and this tool helps make that connection. Again, for developing writers, it promotes those habits of annotation while reading, which is something it took me as a student a very long time to get in the habit of. That learning from reading doesn't just mean reading, it means writing. And PowerNotes is a really great way to help students develop those habits of annotation as they read. So they're gaining knowledge from what they read, but that knowledge is something that can be used. Finally, this is, I think, is the greatest advantage that I've found using PowerNotes one-on-one with students, is that it gives students something to show for the reading that they've done. For confident writers, it allows them to create a usable outline on which they can build. I've worked with students in PowerNotes through the process and find that sometimes they just want to use it for the initial read, and later on they'll use the outline they created in PowerNotes in another document. It doesn't always take them to the end, but it gives them a very, very useful jump start on that learning, even if they don't use all of the features in the end. For developing writers, again, it makes visible their engagement with the text. This means that texts and reading and knowledge aren't something that kind of floats around in our brains until we're ready to sort of get a butterfly net and hook it down. This gives them something to show for the reading that they've done, so that when they sit down to figure out what they want to write, they've got ideas to pull from right in front of them. Based on the work that I've been doing in our reading and writing studio with students, these would be my recommendations for using PowerNotes one-on-one in consultations. First of all, and I think every person has talked about this so far, empower staff who work directly with students to use PowerNotes on their own. This is why I'm able to use it effectively with students, because it was a great tool for me in my own professional work. And I can give that information to students and talk about my own experience and show them what I have done and how I've actually used it for the work I do. Particularly for developing writers, I recommend mentoring students as they become familiar with the program. Like any technology, doesn't necessarily stand on its own as a learning tool. We want to be there to help students figure out how to use it, figure out how it can work for them. And one thing that I've seen really effective with the students I've worked with is when introducing the research process, introduce PowerNotes concurrently. If the research process is tied up in this idea that as we read, we take notes, we classify things, we put it together in this way, I found that to be a really effective strategy.